Hello, I am Sebastian Stodolak, and it's a pleasure to open a third Warsaw Enterprise Institute debate on social Europe. Today we'll try to focus on the crucial question whether more unified social protection is something European Union really needs at this very moment of history, where economic recovery after pandemic is something we're all craving. Our guests today are Karolina Mickute, expert from Lithuanian Free Market Institute. Good morning.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Peter Barton, lecturer from Servo Institute and Natlands Group chief economist.
Hello from Prague.
Kai Weiss, Austrian Economic Center.
Hi,
Hello,
thanks for having me.
And Mr. Jonas Herby, economist and expert from SIPOS, Denmark.
Thank you.
Also, we have with us Tomasz Wróblewski, who is obviously president of Warsaw Enterprise Institute.
Hello.
Hello to you all. In the first two debates, we were talking about European Pillar of Social Rights. And the document title tells it all. It's an enumeration of what EU should be, things should be respected as a social right. And great part of the document is dedicated to social protection and inclusion in the labor market. So the first question here goes to Ms. Karolina Mickute. Your think tank is very well known for developing so-called employment flexibility index for EU and OECD countries. So if we take only EU members, there are big differences among them in terms of employment flexibility, of course. Is there any country that could be used as a paradigm which every other should follow in this respect?
Thank you for your question and for acknowledging our work. So besides that I have a legal education in European Union law particularly, I was also the head researcher in charge of compiling the flexibility index for the past 3 years. So generally, I think that the word index implies that there is no one like core or ultimate country that everyone should follow, given primarily because we all have different, let's say, traditions, I suppose. For example, typically throughout the years, Denmark was like in the top index countries. However, that is mainly given its tradition of social dialogue. So Lithuania cannot brag about having like a vast tradition of social dialogue. However, I suppose there's no like etalon country on employment flexibility. And this is exactly why the index that the Free Market Institute has compiled with several other think tanks in the region not only shows, I mean, like, why is it important so much? It not only shows the leeway of how much employers and employees can tailor their own personal, let's say, labor relations, it also shows the resilience of the economy as such to be responsive to economic shocks. And that is particularly relevant in times of COVID pandemic and the times getting out of it. So this is crucial because not only it allows the employment flexibility as such, it allows more job creation and incentivizes like the pluralistic nature of the employment market as such. It also shows how the economy can be resilient. So
if you take a look at the European Union members during pandemic, and if we try to compare the tempo of adjustment to those various happenings like lockdowns, for example, with the level of flexibility in particular countries, is there any correlation, like, you know, those more flexible were quicker to adapt and those less flexible were slower, for example?
We haven't done any particular research in compiling these relations to those countries, but supposedly those countries which allow more leeway, for example, for fixed term contracts, and particularly a lot of attention should be drawn to labor costs as such, and enabling the relocation of labor force. So labor costs are particularly important in the COVID, let's say in the light of the COVID, because it allows saving as much workplaces as possible. And typically, like assuming from the research that we have done, those countries which impose extremely high burdens in terms of redundancy and hiring, they should be suffering more losses.
Mm-hmm. So when you take this European pillar of social rights, or to call it short, European social Euro ideal, when you take it and when you look at it from the perspective of what you just said about flexibility, is it something that we should look forward? Implementation of all those rights is something that we should expect to improve the situation, or maybe it will, work against flexibility in employment.
This is something that I particularly wanted to outline in this debate, is that this complex outlook to the labor relations and the employment market is exactly what is, in my opinion, lacking among those social pillar rights and such. So, for example, probably we all know about the draft directive currently on the minimum wage. So on the one hand, it sort of conflicts with the principle of subsidiarity as such, particularly that suggestion to have a mandatory ratio between the minimum wage and the median of the countries. However, it does offer some criteria, especially those of efficiency and productivity, which should be primarily taken into account when determining minimum wage. Especially, let's say, I think it should be discussed more at the EU and national levels, is the option to diversify or differentiate the minimum wage. So all of the society, at least in Lithuania, is super focused on the differentiating it on the age criteria or on certain categories of workers. However, I believe that other countries have the same problem of vast discrepancies between the ratio of the minimum and the average wage in the country among the regions. So even in Lithuania, the median, the ratio of the minimum wage and the average salary can be like 20% to the other side. So this option for differentiating minimum wage according, for example, to the productivity or labor cost in certain regions, that could benefit the interest of the Union and its member states. However, we must also keep in mind the level of subsidiarity, which generally implies allowing the member states to determine themselves what they see as more effective. And perhaps the criteria of productivity and so on, they could be beneficial for generally politicizing the whole process of determining the minimum wage.
So maybe the best option would be to leave the minimum wage laws to the member state for them to decide.
I suppose that would be strategically the best, particularly given that, for example, we didn't have any issues with the directive in Lithuania because we already apply these criteria in determining the minimum wage. So I suppose, yeah. I don't know whether this is the time to, I think it answers your question as well. Personally, a threat, what I see currently is the European Commission's utter focus on the digital economy and platform work. So there has been an analysis enacted on analyzing the employment rights of platform workers, let's say food couriers and such. So I believe that this European Commission strategy on having a directive, particularly expanding employment relations and employment guarantees to something that is the provision of service in its essence, that should be taken with caution.
Thank you very much, Karolina. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Barton from Czech Republic. According to this index we just mentioned, the Employment Flexibility Index, Czechia is quite high in flexibility. Is that all in line with your personal observations?
Well, it depends. If the index says so, then of course, who am I to argue with the numbers? But the debate about minimum wage stresses out the general problem with the proposed regulations, in that they always pick up pick out one particular aspect and try to regulate it. Whilst each country, let's say minimum wage is only one aspect of social policy. There probably isn't other reason why you would want to regulate minimum wage or establish minimum wage other than it as one of components of social policy. Now, if you regulate minimum wage and do not regulate the others, then of course it's going to be completely out of whack, because every country sets its minimum wage in relation to its other aspects of social policy. Now, of course, there's two possibilities of solving that. Either you regulate everything, but that's going to be impossible, really, because there is such a huge difference, just historic, cultural, and also even things like seasonal differences across the EU. And therefore, within this varied framework where each country sets its own social policy, including minimum wage, relative to its own conditions, would better left be alone to the country to be determined, rather than regulate one part, such as minimum wage. For example, in the Czech Republic, we have minimum wage, which hardly anybody actually receives. We have one of the lowest Europe-wide rate of participation in the minimum wage. So we have a formal minimum wage. Everybody gets, a half of the political spectrum gets annoyed how terribly low it is, but nobody actually notices how few people actually get it. The real problem with Czech labor market is that the minimum wage actually determines then up to 17 other categories of guaranteed wages, which go all the way up across professions. So you actually have, so to speak, minimum wage relevant for university professors, even for IT workers, right? So that kind of completely blows everybody's mind, because IT workers typically are the least vulnerable social group to actually suffer from low wages, and yet the minimum wage in the country, then multiplied a couple of times, actually provides a guaranteed wage that everybody should follow for even relatively well paid. So that's why the devil is in the detail. Once you start regulating one aspect of social policy, such as minimum wage, then you are going to produce and introduce even more imperfections and problems into other aspects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, get it. But how exactly minimum wage would translate into other regulations in the context of those social pillar of social rights? Where do you see the links here exactly?
Well, the link is we have sufficiently low minimum wage so that, and we can afford to have a relatively low minimum wage because we have a lot of other aspects of the social security system that compensate for the minimum wage.
So in Czech Republic, we have flexible labor market, but on the other hand, we have a lot of social protection. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
well, which is also a part of the problem of the inflexible labor market. So from the point of view of minimum wage, the labor market is relatively flexible, it is true, but it has a lot of other inflexibilities from other points of view. Now, given that the other compensations are usually tied to the level of the minimum wage, once you increase it because of some Europe-wide regulation, that automatically increases all of the other aspects, because it assumes that the shock to the system is not that Europe-wide an increase of minimum wage has been established, but the system assumes that somehow the situation or inflation has gone up, and therefore you haven't adjusted the minimum wage upwards because of inflation, and therefore all of the other inflexibilities are then just copied from the rise of the minimum wage. And therefore, it puts out of whack the other compensations, because they all are in one way or another linked to the minimum wage. So once you thwart one of them away from the equilibrium, then the other equilibria are just going to collapse.
So every time people speak of European social pillar of European pillar of social rights, every time they do it, it always ends up talking about minimum wage. There are a lot of other articles. why are we talking about them? I mean, are they not important? Because our discussion kind of naturally evolved towards the minimum wage, even though I didn't mention it. So is it the only important part of this European social Europe?
No, actually, if you look at the 10 points of the third chapter of the social rights, point number 14 is probably most relevant here, and to my mind, it's actually the most dangerous one as well. A lot of the other points are you could make a good case. For example, the increased flexibility for participating of the disabled in the labor market. There is obviously going to be a lot of work that you could argue would be better, because it's even from the point of view of dignity for the disabled people, it's better to give them an opportunity of employment rather than stigmatize them with just receiving social benefits forever. But precisely point 14 talks about supplying everybody who is lacking sufficient resources with adequate minimum income, not necessarily wage. And that's a huge difference, because minimum income obviously differs from wage. Wage is just something that you earn through work. But once you have guaranteed minimum income, not minimum wage, that income is independent of your employment status. And that is why I see point number 14 as being the relatively most dangerous, because it opens up the door towards a very popular idea of universal basic income, which is for labor markets, at least, as we understand them today, that is potentially the biggest change that we would see with labor markets. And the idea has been circulating at least for the last 5-10 years, depending on who you follow. And it seems that now, precisely with COVID, a lot of people see it as an opportunity that with this big shock to the system, now is the time to change everything, the big reset, as the World Economic Forum sees it. And we might actually see on the back of regulation number 14 or proposal number 14, that 1 or 2 years down the line, we would see, look, it's in number 14, we have to pass universal basic income, we have to mandate it across the European Union. Now, there might be a debate about the benefits of universal basic income, but this would be a way of avoiding having a conversation about universal basic income and almost mandate it from the top, because that will be through the chapter 14 or point 14, that will be a way of mandating minimum income regardless of whether it's wage or not.
Maybe it's a way, maybe minimum income is a way to ensure absolute flexibility, because when I am sure I will receive income from the state, I can be fired from my work, immediately without feeling the real consequences of this happening. And all this social Europe ideal is kind of filled with spirit of, on one hand, rather flexible market. I mean, I can read it from some articles that it is designed as to preserve this free market ideals, at least in this respect. On the other hand, it's designed to protect people from, it's designed to protect people in terms of for example, losing employment. And here with us is Jonas Herby from Denmark, and Denmark is also a perfect example of a country that for a long time has been implementing this flexicurity model. Can you please tell us how flexicurity model is working? Is it really as effective as advertised by many?
I think the labor market in Denmark, compared to other European countries, are pretty well working. Maybe Carolina knows more about how it's compared to other countries, but one thing that is different from what we have just talked about is that we have no official minimum wage in Denmark. If you can have somebody working for you for €1 an hour, then at least legally you are fine. And I think if we go back to what we discussed about the minimum wage and the EU regulation, there are two questions that comes to my mind. The first thing is this good regulation? And the problem with minimum wage is that it's probably very bad regulation, because what it does, I mean, when you work, you get paid if you're productive. So if the companies can make money on you, they will hire you. If they lose money on you, they will fire you. So if you go in and say that this person that can make €5 for the company, you have to pay him €10, then the company will fire him because they lose €5 for every hour he works for them. And this is not a magic. Minimum wage is not a magic trick to increase the employees' productivity. Only skills can increase the employees' productivity. And one way to get skills is to be on the labor market. So the minimum wage in the US, for example, one of the main effects is that it makes it more difficult for young people to get into the labor market, and make it more difficult for Black people to get into the labor market. And if they can't get into the labor market, they can't get the skills they need to increase their productivity, and then they can't move up the career ladder and end up with a decent wage in 5 or 10 years or so. So that's one problem, that the EU, there's a risk that the EU will push bad regulation out on all member states. And then there's another problem that is probably maybe even more important, and that is that one reason we can now look at Denmark and Germany and wherever we are and say that, oh, they have something here that seems to work for them, is that we have different regulation in different countries. And that's what we call the competition, right? So you have a lot of different what's called organizations, we can call it, that do things differently and learn from each other, and can try to figure out if maybe the minimum wage is a good tool to get what we want. And then they can look at Denmark and see, oh, maybe it's not necessary because Denmark is doing really well without minimum wage. So maybe we should go away from that and have less regulation as we have in Denmark, where it's really easy to hire and fire people. Maybe that will work better. So all these differences between countries is a tool to make other countries better over time. And if EU starts to regulate that and mandate that all countries has to be alike, and as Peter said, countries will be alike on other areas too, even if we only regulate one area. The more alike countries are, the slower the innovation in good regulation will be, and the worse the future will be, basically. So I think that's a really, really important thing to think about then, that when maybe there's a country, maybe all countries should be just like Sweden. Maybe we should just implement the Swedish regulation in all countries, and that would make the world better today. But in the future, there's a risk that the world will be worse, because then we can't evolve anymore. Then we can't innovate, and we can't see what works in different circumstances.
But I can see a great similarity between the ideals written in this pillar of European social rights and the Danish model, actually. So it's like Danish model to be put on a European scale. So maybe it's a good idea, because let's leave a minimum wage for a while, but all the rest of the articles are describing something that actually can be found in your country.
Yeah, and that's what I mean, is that maybe it's a good idea right now, but if it is a good idea, why don't the member countries just implement it themselves? Why does EU have to force it down on the member countries? So that's the first problem, and the first question. And the second problem, the first problem is that we lose this diversity that makes us able to learn in the future, because all countries will be more and more alike, and we'll lose the ability to learn from differences between countries.
So when you have this flexicurity model, on one hand, the labor market is very flexible. On the other hand, government plays a very important role. It's actually very activist government, training people to find another job, right? So we demand this model demands not only resources, financial resources to be supported, but also demands a high government efficiency, right? So maybe that's the reason why some other countries didn't follow Denmark, because they couldn't afford this model, at least yet. What do you think?
Yeah, I think maybe we should be a little careful to before we drag too many conclusions based on Denmark, because this is the English term also the hen and the egg, because Denmark used to be a very, very liberal, classical liberal country with very little regulation and very low taxes. And then in the 60s, we put on top of that this big welfare state. But we can only have that because we are a very liberal country. So Denmark worked pretty well before the welfare state. Very low unemployment, very rich country. And now we have this welfare state. But just before we say that the flexicurity model is the reason that Denmark is doing well, we have to remember that Denmark was doing well before the flexicurity model. So maybe it's just, maybe there's nothing to learn there. Maybe the real thing to learn here for EU is to deregulate and don't do too much central planning, basically, because that's what made Denmark rich. But then again, I mean, people in Denmark are mostly happy about the flexicurity model, and it is nice to know that no matter what happens in your life, then you, I mean, somebody will back you up. If you go bankrupt, if you lose your job, you will have a pretty decent income when you're unemployed. But there's also cost to that, because it means that people can behave as they want without risking their lives, basically. So it's easier to be a crook in Denmark, because I mean, if none of your friends wants to what it's called, like if nobody wants to do business with you, the state will still go in and finance your life. So there's no free lunch, as we all know.
But there are free beers. There are free beers. I don't know whether you heard in New Jersey, if you are vaccinated, the state of New Jersey gives you a beer.
Oh, that's a good reason to be vaccinated.
Thank you very much. We're all pretty liberal in a classic sense here, but even considering the possibility of state intervening in the free market will be out of question for the real gatekeepers of free market, so Austrian economists. And thankfully, one of them is here with us, Kai Weiss from Austrian Economic Center. So now, question for you. When you read those European Union documents on social Europe, what was your first impression? Was it like, oh, it's garbage, let's get rid of it? Or maybe you found something interesting there, something worth implementing or talking of?
Yeah, thanks. Putting pressure on me as the gatekeeper for classical liberalism, but I'll try my best. No, I mean, looking at it, I was not overly surprised. I think it fits into the whole EU vision that Brussels is following overall, which is mainly that obviously you want to be competitive. Obviously, you want to get out of the COVID slump. And what I definitely liked is obviously there are good intentions. They want to, make life better for workers and for those in need and so forth. But I always felt reading it that good intentions are not enough. You also have to have the right policies. And I feel like on that, the pillar of social rights often falls short, because it's same as all the other things that the EU is planning on green transformation, on digital transition, and all these things. It's always based on, centralized one-size-fits-all solutions, when, as others have already said quite correctly, one of the basic pillars of the EU is subsidiarity, because it's a very complex system. You have 27 different governments, 27 different countries with different traditions, with different economic systems and so forth. You can't just pack all of them into one. And one thing that from an Austrian perspective, from a perspective of Austrian economics, what I immediately thought of when I read it was how most policies are clouded in nice buzzwords that everyone agrees with, which is probably, I would think, one of the reasons why there's a big sentiment among the European population for EU social policy, because why would you be opposed for why would you be opposed to something which is social or just or fair or inclusive, or, you know, which brings us more dignity or brings us new rights or something like that? It's what Friedrich Hayek, one of the famous Austrian economists, said. He always called social justice, the word social justice, for instance, he called it as a weasel word. And I felt like the entire program is full of these words that sound really good. You don't really know all the time what the consequences will be. There will be, as others have already said, there will be many unintended consequences. It might not actually work as planned, but they sound kind of good. And I think one of the word that, for instance, really, you know, I think was emphasized a lot was rights. You know, the European pillar of social rights, it has full of these social rights that are basically human rights, but they kind of, you know, it's a long list of rights that I at least have never really understood as rights in the same way as rights to life or rights to property. Those are just, they always seem kind of things that, you know, bureaucrats perhaps think up, but it's very little backed up by something. And that's
there's one more side to this story of social Europe. You, Kai, are working at a think tank based in Austria, which is one of the richest country in Europe with very generous social benefits and social protection net. You are yourself German as well, as I remember, right? So German is the same story, actually. So, and when you put new obligations on European Union members, you have to keep in mind that not every one of them is at the same level of development. And, you know, maybe it's much easier for countries like yours to comply with this social Europe ideals in comparison with countries like Poland, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on. So maybe what's being described as a just version of Europe in these documents are actually leading to unjust Europe. What do you think of it, of this scenario?
Yeah, definitely. And I actually had to think of, you know, coming from Germany, when Jonas described the example of Denmark, I had to think about Germany as well, because I often get asked, especially when I'm abroad away from Europe, I often get asked, why is Germany so successful? Even though, for instance, they have a big welfare state. But I feel like it might actually be very similar to Denmark, where Germany had a very free economy a few decades ago and has been one of the freer economies in Europe. And that might actually be the reason why Germany has been doing better than others. And so saying that Germany, for instance, is successful because of welfarism, I think really misses the mark. But yeah, you are correct. And I think when the program that the EU is planning talks about fair prices, just prices, and all these kinds of things, what does that, like, I don't even know what that really means, to be honest. Like, what is a just price? I would say the just price is the one that comes into being on the market, because that's where you actually have, you know, you have actual individuals with their wants and needs coming together, and through interactions coming up with a price. That seems like the fairest price out there, because all other prices that are considered fair are subject to political decision-making, subject to regulatory capture, corruption, all these kinds of things, and also to simple subjective opinions. So what is actually a just or a fair price, or a just or fair wage? I don't really see an explanation on that in the EU's documents.
You said that the narrative in which being a generous welfare state as a condition for being rich is a false one, but maybe being highly developed country and also being very generous in terms of social policies at the same time is not interfering with each other. I mean, maybe being rich does not, or being generous does not imply that it contradicts development and, you know, these economic foundations.
Yeah, definitely. It is obviously true that if you're already based in a rich country, you may be able to have more welfare programs, even though I would still say that they might be harming the economy in the end. But you may be, okay, we can suffer a little economically, but then also have some more programs that help those who are in need, obviously. But especially for countries who aren't as developed, I think the focus shouldn't be on building a welfare state in the same way as the West has done, or like many Western European countries have done, but to actually help getting everyone wealthy. And that doesn't really happen by redistributing money. You can't create wealth by redistributing it. You have to actually, do things, and you can do this the best way on the free market. And the free market doesn't really show up in most. Sadly, I mean, I wish it was different, but the free market doesn't really show up in most EU plans, and that's really bad, because that would actually be the way to get all of us out of the COVID slump, but also to get countries which aren't as developed to converge with other countries who are wealthier, to sort of catch up, if that is the goal.
Mm-hmm. So now let me turn to Mr. Tomek Wróblewski. Up till now, our discussion seems to lead us to the conclusion that it's rather about the dynamics of this social rights than the very content of those European documents that is dangerous. That the interactions between, like we talked about, minimum wage and the other pillars are more important than the pillars themselves, because in the end, one regulation leads to another regulation, and we are on this downward spiral of regulating everything everywhere. Another thing is the arbitrariness of government, and in this respect of European Union officials, that comes in while interpreting those pillars. Yeah, because let's be honest, European elites are left-leaning in terms of economy, so probably they will interpret even those neutral formulations from social rights pillars in this lefty sense, rather than in free market meaning, rather than trying to sustain, for example, competitiveness among European nations. So what should be our strategy here? Those poorer countries of Europe, should we try to prevent such documents from appearing, from formulating, from being published on European level? Or maybe we should work out different strategy. Maybe we should work on national level. What is the right option here?
Thank you. I think that there's a question of what goal we have, where we going, and what is the aim, and this should be formulated, because I see a lot of discrepancy between what the EU is saying and what it is doing, because we keep saying that Europe has to be chasing United States or Asian countries in competitiveness and economy and well-being of their citizens. And this is this funny race, because I get a feeling that it's like a boat race, but it's just a less and less water underneath, shallow water. And we add up a lot of elements to the boat to make it heavier to chase. And we keep saying we add a little more engines, a little more equipment, just to be more effective in competing with bigger boats on a deep water. So this is the problem, because we are using a lot of elements, a lot of regulations in a lot of areas. It has been mentioned here about digital regulations, climate regulations, now the social pillar, and it's all just making this boat heavier and heavier in this shallow water. EU is losing out on competitiveness, innovations, academic excellence, and all this sooner or later affects also standard of life. And what Brussels does, they're saying that we have to somehow keep up with our lifestyle, our well-being. And so we have to do something to preserve our European lifestyle. It's just, this is kind of like legislating this lifestyle instead of helping them develop our well-being. So my problem is that we are using wrong tools to the right aims. We have some very well-stated aims we have in European Union, which is well-being of their citizens, equality, competitiveness, innovation. It's all great names. But then when you look at the tools, they're actually going backwards and pushing this boat down. So I think the documents like the social pillar shall be there. It's just the question what we are trying to achieve. I remember the first time I heard about it, I've been invited to this nice villa near Berlin, and it was a close meeting with some think tanks, economists, and there was a discussion about this just general idea in 2017 and about this social pillar. And I was kind of surprised to see that the people who were invited were mainly either labor organizations, social activists, very few people who had a different point of view. So it's just, there's no enough discussion in Europe. It's not enough challenging way attempted by the European Commission. And the same thing I see within the countries. And we are in Poland, and Poland actually is going much forward and actually using a lot of elements of the social pillar, adopting them currently. And this, our government is losing on some other political fields, is trying to add more social rights and actually raising minimum wage, adding a lot of regulations, labor regulations, saying that this is how we're going to achieve our excellence and richness of our citizens. But the truth is that Poland is just a perfect example that we reach the level of development where we are at, and we really grow really fast for the last 20 years, but thanks to the fact that we didn't have as many regulations as most Western countries. So we were able to catch up. Every year, Warsaw Enterprise Institute does this index of how fast different countries are catching up with the European leader. In this, we as Germany, and we can see very interesting phenomena that Poland is actually raising, but because quite few countries are falling down. And countries that are having more labor regulations, more raising minimum wages, actually are going backwards. And it's a problem of a lot of European countries. So all I'm just saying is our problem is not that we don't have good enough regulations or that we have too little regulations, but we are already over-regulated for the aims we state that we have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. If we were to focus still on this document that we started with, the social pillars, the European pillars of social rights, and if we were to choose one point, one article that we would gladly see removed from it, like the first step to prevent the situation from getting worse. So what would be, Tomek, what would be your suggestion here?
Oh, I think this what Peter said, this adequate income. I think this is, I agree that this is very dangerous. I mean, it opens wide space for a lot of other regulations or other options. And there's a discussion about the right for housing. There's a right for employment and adequate pay. This is just a slippery slope to a socialistic country. This is exactly the some of those regulations I do remember from communist Poland, when we all had a right to work, we all had a right to proper, adequate housing, and we had neither of them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. The same question to Mrs. Karolina Mickute.
I'm absolutely bubbling with ideas after this discussion. I should agree on the part of, just checking my notes, on the adequate income part, because what I don't see that this is being acknowledged enough is that income and wages are simply a result, and they are not just a lone standing goal. And this is what another point that is missing that we could is instead of the adequate income part is about investing in human capital, because I believe that Mr. Herby, you outlined that by increasing the wage, you do not in any way increase their productivity. Therefore, a sort of like artificial establishment of prices of labor, let's say, it eliminates any chances of exchange between your goods and services and what you offer in that sense. So that should be my enthusiastic approach to this question you asked.
Yeah, there's a question there. What happens if the companies start losing out? Are we cutting the minimum wages? What's the solution in case the company or the country is in the recession? Are we cutting the minimum wage to everybody? How we go about that?
Especially when the average wages due to the coronavirus pandemic, they decrease. So sort of the directive would imply that you should also accordingly decrease the minimum wage if your goal is an adequate or proper minimum wage. But they're sort of refusing these questions.
Mr. Jonas?
Yeah, there was I just want to tell you about a story that was in the Danish newspapers yesterday about some people from Belarus that worked in Denmark at very low wages compared to Danish standards. And apparently that was a big problem for Danish politicians. There was one from the Liberal Party who said that this was too much. He wanted people to be able to work in Denmark, but this was too much. The problem was that if you read the article, the people who received the apparently low wage was very happy with it, because they said that this is much better than what we can get in Belarus. And the problem with minimum wages, one of the other problems with minimum wages is that if you are from Belarus and wants to work in Denmark, you compete against the Danes who speak Danish, who knows the culture, who knows the Danish society, and you can't just by like this get the same skills as the Danes. So the only way you can compete with them is to work for less, and that was exactly what these guys were doing from Belarus. They worked for less than Danes would ever want to do, but that made it able, that improved their life, because first of all they were happy with the wage, and second of all we know that they wouldn't work here if they weren't happy with the job. So I think it's I mean, there's a lot of good if I can answer a question too, there's a lot of I think I think there are maybe 20 points here that we could point out that's really bad policies, but I think it's right to point at the minimum wage as a problem in this. But I think basically all of them are really makes me a little scared, basically.
There are articles saying that the aim should be to increase the level of training among European workers. And there are some goals set for that, saying that at least 60% of European workforce should be in training every year. It's a very high goal, but maybe it's worthwhile. Maybe it's a good goal, you know, to put people into the constant training so they can be able to find new jobs when they lose their old ones. Maybe that's something that is, you know, important, and that is worth stressing in this social pillars. Also, this is garbage, and maybe we should also get rid of that one.
The best way to get I haven't had official training since I finished my studies, but I'm able to do a lot more today than I was when I left the university, because I've learned so much working. So one of the best way to acquire new skills is by working, and they have this minimum wage that will prevent people from working. So just to me, it just doesn't come together. And I have a few relatives that are handicapped, and when I read this point 15, this at least in the Danish translation, no, it's not point 15. It's whatever, but it's about handicapped and their rights. 17. Okay, yeah. Then it's just, I mean, it scares me a little, because when I look out and see what some countries, I mean, of course, I agree that we should help people who are handicapped, but I'm not sure that the way that we help them is always the best way to help them. And when you put this into an EU program, there's a great chance that we'll do more harm than good, basically.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barton. The same question to you, but please do not talk of minimal income and minimal wage, because we already talked about that, and you already talked about that. Something more. Let's try to build another point of resistance.
I had two to strike out because they are very dangerous, and two to strike out because they make absolutely no sense. I've already mentioned the dangerous one of income. The second most dangerous I see in the point number 12, where there's actually two dangers. One is, again, the weasel word of social protection. That could mean absolutely anything. Usually when we talk about social protection, we want to protect the unemployed. Now, I'm not sure what social protection of those in employment would mean. That's on top of everything. It's trying to protect somebody who already is reasonably protected because they have a job. And the second point, the second danger of this particular point 12 is I suspect that what's behind it is trying to, is the European Union fighting against the self-employed, trying to somehow make it as burdensome to employ the self-employed as it is to employ the standard workers, and therefore trying to mold everybody as much as possible into the standard, you've got a job which is taxed at a high rate, where you pay social security, and again trying to mold everybody into the same pattern of work, from which the self-employment is one way of not just escaping, but also an important way to encourage entrepreneurship. You cannot be entrepreneurial whilst being employed, but you can be pretty entrepreneurial whilst being self-employed. So that fight against the entrepreneurial spirit among the self-employed through trying to mold them into the same pattern as
far as I remember, there is the article saying expressis verbis openly that European Union should support self-employment. There is this, open statement.
Well, it says everybody, including the self-employed, have the right to adequate social protection. Now, the way I read it is we have already done, we, the European Union, enough to provide the social protection for the employed. Now we want to impose the same burden and same constraints on the self-employed, i.e., self-employed also would have to be subject to some sort of minimum standards, minimum wage, and that all constrains the flexibility of the self-employed. So just from the reading of it, I see that it could be interpreted as actually trying to make self-employment as burdensome as employment itself now there is. Very quickly, I just want to mention the 2 points which to me don't make any sense. The first one is number 13, where at the beginning, you're trying to guarantee all of the support for the unemployed. You may want to make sure that they have enough support and enough adequate income, really, whilst unemployed. That's in the first long sentence. And the second sentence basically dismisses it completely by saying such benefits shall not constitute a disincentive for a quick return to employment. Now, those two sentences are completely in contrast. You might want to, for some reason, for social reasons, want to encourage better social provisions for the unemployed whilst you're away from employment, but you cannot at the same time hold that it should be disincentive. Once you increase the benefits when you're not working, then automatically that constitutes a disincentive for a quick return. I think if we could find out and discover a system of providing the support which is not constituting disincentive for a quick return, I think that would be worth a Nobel Prize. So that's a big problem for me, at least, with point 13. And the second point, which to me doesn't make internal sense, is the last point, where at the beginning you're trying to guarantee the right to access to everything, to water, sanitation, energy, transport, financial services, and digital communications. Well, why just these things, right? I mean, why not guarantee access to everything? And yet, in the second part, you say that if you are in need, then your support will be guaranteed, will be subsidized. Now, that to me, again, doesn't make an internal sense. Either you have a right to access, but if you have a right to access all of these essential services, that already implies in itself some sort of government guarantees of minimum standards, government subsidies and all of that. If you want it, fine, that's already covered in the first part. Now, why on top of all these wide access subsidies, you would need to provide extra subsidies for those in need when they already have it guaranteed just like everybody else from the first part is beyond me, and therefore, to me, number 20 is just like 13, internally inconsistent.
Thank you very much for your answer. And the same question goes to Kai Weisse, although there's not much articles left to be criticized.
Yeah, I mean, I would have, if you had asked me first, I would have said, where should I start? But now that all of them have already been named pretty much, I'm having some difficulty. No, I completely agree with what most have said, namely that the minimum income thing is the most problematic. Beyond that, just two that I think are quite funny. I think Peter already mentioned one of them, which is the right to access to essential services, including financial services and digital communications, which is just, it's just confusing. And the same thing goes, I don't know if that's specifically in chapter 3 or generally just in the pillar of social rights, is something like a work to work-life balance. I think those, both of them are just really, really good examples of what does the EU even think is a right. Like I'm generally confused what they think a right is, because I wouldn't necessarily see myself as having a right to work and life balance or have a right to financial services. I work for a think tank. I don't have any financial capabilities. So does that mean I would fall under this? Or do I have a right to digital communications? Like I don't really see the what does right mean in that sense? And this, but I think that the general problem is, that why should the EU do all of these things? And I think just to go back to your question, Sebastian, on having, for instance, the goal of having 60% of all adults participate in training every year, or having at least 78% of the population employed. Those are noble goals, but why should government set these goals, and why should, I don't really see the justification for that. Not even if national governments were to say 60% of us have to be trained. Like, why? I mean, if they want to do that, then that's great. And of course, there are certain destructive forces, let's say, with new technologies coming in, that people have to change jobs and stuff. And then they obviously should go to training, and they should have these opportunities. But why should you have a goal? 60% have to go. That doesn't make any sense.
Thank you very much. And the last question, and I'd like to get you a short answer. Let's play wizards for a bit. Let's take out our crystal balls. And the question is whether European Union should, within a decade, implement minimal universal income for everybody. Starting from Jonas Herby.
Can you say the question again?
Will European Union implement universal basic income for everybody within a decade, say? Do you think it will
ask if they will or if they should?
But because I didn't hear the answer.
Do you ask if they will or if they should?
No. We already established that they shouldn't, but I'm now asking whether you think they will.
Oh, okay. I'm not that much into EU politics, so it will be a guess, but I don't think that will ever happen. At least not in my lifetime.
Peter Barton?
I think the 10 years between now and then will be spent talking about it. I think some countries will try to implement it. I don't think there's going to be a European-wide implementation of it because that's going to be hard precisely for everybody to agree on the level of it. However, the danger really with the universal basic income that I see is not the level itself, but the problem is that it will not, as it's supposed to, replace all the other various social services. So if, again, it's down to the so-called unicorn governance, right? If you can believe, from Mike Munger, it's a famous concept, if you believe that in reality we would be able to stick to universal basic income, look, 50 years down the line, it might be necessary because we will have advanced in our productive ability so much that we will be able to afford it easily. The problem with it now will be that it's not going to replace all the other social security programs. They will come through the back door again on top of the universal basic income, and therefore all the benefits, theoretical ones, that could come out of it will not in reality be realized.
Thank you very much. And Tomasz Wróblewski?
Well, I do believe in the cycles, in not just economy, but also social cycles. And I get the feeling that we've been there already in the 70s, 1970s, and the world also been in a trap of too many social regulations, and we get to the certain point where especially European Union, but probably not only the US, will get that the economy will get stuck. We get real serious recession, and then we'll come back to our senses and we'll start working back. Deregulating and deminimizing our wages and trying to build the economy back. So I think in 10 years, this is exactly where we're going to be, but this could be, those 10 years will be difficult.
Thank you very much. Karolina Mickute?
This is possibly the trickiest thing I have ever heard, and unfortunately my magic 8 ball is completely silent. So personally, I can see sort of like rosebuds of these universal basic incomes initiatives because there are certain discussions on employment benefits, so they should ensure some kind of adequate living conditions and so on. It's neglected, or at least my hope and I bet my all in on the concept that how to say, we should primarily avoid the unemployment trap. And this is another topic, I suppose, that should be included in the social rights. So just avoiding the employment trap is typically inclined with, we should not make it that being unemployed would be more worthwhile than being employed. So I rely completely on my legal knowledge, saying that this is not in line with subsidiarity, and I see no perspectives of this happening. Yet I'm afraid it might.
Thank you very much. And Kai?
My cynical hope is always that when it comes to these proposals, thankfully, we still have unanimity on the EU level. So if there's just one country which says no, it won't happen. So let's hope most of the things that we've discussed today, there will be at least one country which says no. Then again, the last year, also with the recovery fund and all these kinds of things that have happened have made me a little more a little less hopeful that bad ideas are blocked, because obviously we're in a crisis and we can do everything we want, basically. But let's hope there will be one country, at least always, with most of these bad ideas that says no. And if that's happening, then I don't think the EU can introduce these wild ideas.
Thank you all for your time and for this debate. Hopefully we're gonna see each other on another occasion in the future. Thank you.